He woke up on an ordinary morning, expecting the usual noise of a busy life, the familiar brightness of a California day, the small routines that make a celebrity feel almost normal. Then the world began to fracture. Vision that once framed scripts, faces, and the steady smile of a man who always seemed in control started to blur, as if someone had smeared the lens of his life with oil. Sound thinned into a distant hum, then slipped away in uneven pieces. Balance became a betrayal. The body that had carried him through long shooting days, red carpets, late nights, and early flights suddenly refused the simplest command. Standing felt like negotiating with the floor. Walking felt like asking permission from invisible forces. And in that first wave of fear, when the mind tries to bargain with reality, there's a particular terror that arrives not with screaming, but with silence. The terror that the person you have been performing as might be the only person the world remembers, while the real you fades without witnesses. For years, Ashton Kutcher had been packaged as certainty. A handsome grin, quick charm, an ease that made audiences believe he was unbreakable. He played the kind of men who land on their feet, who joke their way through chaos, who turn awkward moments into laughter. But illness does not care about public perception. When doctors used the word vasculitis, it was not a headline to him. It was a cold, clinical name for a private panic. Inflammation, blood vessels under attack, a threat that could touch vision, hearing, mobility, and the future all at once. The irony was cruel. He had spent a career learning to control the angle, the timing, the tone, the pause that makes a scene work. Now he was forced to confront the one script no one rehearses, the script where your own body becomes an unreliable narrator. In those moments, the mind does what it always does when it cannot control the present. It opens old doors. It drags the past into the room. It makes pain feel familiar, because familiarity is easier than uncertainty. Long before Hollywood, there was an Iowa childhood shaped by a bond that most people will never fully understand. Not a friendship, not just family, but a mirrored life, a twin brother whose fragility turned a household into a place where love was measured in hospital visits and quiet prayers. When a child watches another child fight for breath, the world changes shape. You learn that laughter can stop abruptly. You learn that the phone ringing can mean everything. You learn that relief is never pure, because survival always leaves a shadow behind. The question you do not say out loud, the question that sounds like guilt even when it is only confusion. That kind of early fear does not disappear when success arrives. It simply hides under louder music, brighter lights, and the false security of being admired. Then, in the years when fame was rising fast and the world seemed eager to celebrate him, another kind of darkness brushed close enough to leave a permanent mark. A night, a late arrival, a door that did not open, a glimpse through glass that looked like a harmless stain on a carpet and later revealed itself as something far worse. The details became public over time, but the most punishing part was never the headlines or the courtrooms. It was the private loop inside the mind that asks the same question again and again with no mercy. If I had been earlier, would anything have changed? That question is not logical, because tragedy rarely bends to timing, but grief does not operate on logic. Grief feeds on possibility. And when you have carried that kind of question, you start to understand how a person can stand among millions of camera flashes and still feel unseen, because the loudest thing in your life is not the applause. It is the memory you cannot rewrite. Even love, the thing people expect to heal everything, can become another arena where pain collects interest. A marriage that captivated the public, a family that looked like a promise, and then the slow erosion that follows loss and pressure and human weakness. When a relationship breaks in front of the whole world, it does not just end. It echoes. It teaches you new forms of shame, new ways to doubt your own worth, new habits of silence. And silence is seductive because it feels safer than explanation. Silence is also where misunderstandings grow, where regret gains weight, where the distance between who you are and who you appear to be becomes exhausting. So when illness arrived, it did not arrive alone. It arrived carrying every unresolved question, every buried memory, every moment he had told himself he was fine. Suddenly, the stakes were not about image or career or the next role. They were about basic human fear. Will I be able to see my children clearly? Will I hear their laughter? Will I walk in the next room without falling? Will the people who think they know me still recognize me if I am no longer the man who looks effortless? And beneath all of that, the quiet question that is harder than any diagnosis. If I disappear from the spotlight, will anyone remember the real person who was struggling long before the cameras noticed? The cruelest thing about a rare illness is not only the pain, it is the way it reorganizes time. They stop being measured by meetings, scripts, or plans. They become measured by symptoms, by whether the blur in your vision lifts for an hour, by whether the ringing in your ears quiets long enough to hear a child's voice without guessing, by whether your legs obey you when you stand, or whether the room tilts like a ship and forces you back down. Ashton described a period where he felt blind, deaf, and unable to walk. 3 pillars of independence collapsing at once. And when that happens, the mind does not simply fear death. It fears humiliation, dependency, and the loss of identity. For someone who built a public life on energy and ease, the prospect of being reduced to a patient number and a set of test results is its own kind of grief. The public tends to consume illness as a headline: diagnosis, recovery, inspirational quote. But inside the body, there is nothing linear about the process. Vasculitis is not a poetic enemy. It is inflammation with consequences, a word that can expand to include organs, nerves, and the fragile wiring that makes you you. And so the real story becomes smaller and more intimate than any entertainment narrative. A man staring at curtains, testing his eyesight like someone checking whether a light bulb still works. A man listening for footsteps, for the soft chaos of family life, praying the world will sound normal again. A man trying to stand and realizing that balance, something you never think about when you have it, is a miracle you only appreciate once it is gone. In that kind of quiet, fear starts writing its own confession. It asks questions you have avoided for years because work and movement were convenient distractions. If I don't recover, what will people say about me? Will they reduce my life to scandals and gossip, to the most dramatic and clickable parts? Will they remember the things I try to build, the ways I try to be useful, the moments I try to grow up? It is a brutal irony. Fame gives you visibility, but it does not guarantee understanding. Sometimes it does the opposite. It turns you into a symbol, and symbols are rarely allowed to be complicated. Ashton's life has always carried this tension between the perceived and the private. Early on, he was the charming face, the bright comedic timing, the man who could make the room laugh. But behind that, there were pressures that never fit neatly into the image. The fear that began in childhood, watching his twin brother fight for life, did not simply disappear when he moved away from Iowa. It evolved. It turned into a habit of scanning for disaster, a readiness for loss, a nervous system trained to expect bad news. When a child learns to associate love with fragility, adulthood can become a search for certainty that never fully arrives. That is one reason tragedy has a way of sticking to certain people in the public imagination. Not because fate selects them, but because their stories contain the kind of sharp contrast audiences recognize. Laughter overlaid with sadness, beauty overlaid with risk, success overlaid with fear. The night of Ashley Ellerin's murder remains one of the most haunting chapters attached to him. Not because he caused it, but because of how close he stood to the edge of it. In stories like that, the human mind naturally reaches for a bargain. If only I had arrived earlier, if only I had looked more closely, if only I had known what I was seeing. That bargain is a trap. It turns a person into a permanent witness against themselves. Then came the years of public love and public fracture. The marriage that many people watched like entertainment. Ashton and Demi, the age gap, the glamour, contained real private grief, including the kind that changes a home at the foundation. Loss can make people cling tighter or drift apart, and often it does both at the same time. One partner tries to outrun pain. The other becomes trapped inside it. Onlookers treat the collapse as gossip, but for the people living it, divorce is not a plot twist. It is an identity collapse. It tells you that you could not protect something you promised to protect. And once that story gets pinned to your name, it follows you. Even when you build a new life, it waits in the background, ready to be reopened by a memoir, a headline, or a sudden surge of public judgment. That judgment became especially intense years later when Ashton and Mila Kunis faced backlash for their support letter connected to Danny Masterson. Whatever the intention behind it, the public reaction was swift and harsh because people do not separate friendship from accountability when the allegations involve sexual violence. And in the age of instant outrage, nuance is fragile. One miscalculation can swallow years of good work. Ashton's resignation from an organization dedicated to protecting children from sexual exploitation became a symbolic moment, a public admission that reputation and mission had collided in the worst way. When you spend part of your life trying to do meaningful work, it is devastating to realize that a single decision can threaten the very cause you claim to care about. Now place that public reckoning beside the private reckoning of illness, and you begin to see why the transcript frames his diagnosis as a goodbye. Not necessarily a goodbye to life, but a goodbye to the version of himself that believed he could outrun consequences, outrun grief, outrun the past. When the body shuts you down, you cannot distract yourself with achievement. You have to sit with yourself. And for someone who has carried trauma, guilt, and public scrutiny, sitting still can feel like punishment. Recovery then becomes more than physical. Relearning how to stand, how to see clearly, how to trust your balance again. These are not only medical milestones. They are symbolic negotiations with fear. Each regained step is a small argument against the voice that says you are finished. Each quiet morning where you wake up and the world is still there is a reminder that survival is not glamorous. It is repetitive. It is humble. It is sometimes boring. And yet it is the most profound victory many people will ever experience. The transcript hints that after that year, something in Ashton shifted, not into saintliness, not into perfection, but into a different set of priorities, smaller life, tighter focus, less hunger for applause. That kind of shift is common after a brush with disability or death. It is not that you stop caring about success. It is that success loses its power to define you. You start asking different questions. Do I have peace? Do I have integrity? Am I present with my family? Am I making choices I can defend when I am alone in a quiet room with no cameras? And perhaps that is the real heartbeat of this story. Not the scandals, not the headlines, not even the diagnosis itself, but the moment a person realizes that what they have been performing as strength might actually be avoidance. True strength might look less like dominating the world and more like living honestly inside your own skin. He did not wake up one morning and decide to become a different man. That is not how transformation works, especially not after illness. Change arrives the way pain does, incrementally, stubbornly, in small humiliations that force you to renegotiate who you are. When Ashton began to recover, what returned first was not certainty, but awareness. He could see again, but vision had lost its innocence. He could hear again, but sound carried a strange weight, as if every laugh and every footstep had become a reminder that the world is not promised. He could walk again, but balance remained something he respected, not something he assumed. The body, once taken for granted, had become a fragile ally. And the mind, stripped of distraction, had begun to count what truly mattered. In Hollywood, the most dangerous illusion is permanence. Careers feel permanent until the phone stops ringing. Beauty feels permanent until the camera shows a new favorite face. Influence feels permanent until one story flips public sentiment. Ashton had lived long enough in that world to understand the rules, but illness rewrote them. A diagnosis like vasculitis does not just threaten your ability to work. It threatens your ability to be. It makes you confront a question that people usually avoid until they have to. If the things that made you valuable are taken away, what remains? This question is especially sharp for someone whose identity has been assembled in public. Ashton's image was built on being liked. Liked as the charming sitcom guy. Liked as the heartthrob. Liked as the approachable star who could crack a joke and make the room feel lighter. But when you're known for being liked, you can start living like love is conditional. One mistake, one misstep, one scandal, and the world withdraws its affection. Illness compounds that fear. It suggests that even if you do everything right, life can still remove the ground beneath you. So the old strategy, perform, succeed, distract, stops working. And what follows can feel like grief, because in a sense you are grieving the self you used to be. The transcript points to a haunted core in his story, and it is worth naming plainly. Ashton has repeatedly been forced into proximity with loss. His twin brother's childhood illness taught him that love and danger can share the same room. The Ashley Ellerin tragedy taught him that time can be cruel in ways that make you question your own humanity. The public collapse of a marriage taught him that devotion does not guarantee stability. And the later backlash around supporting Danny Masterson taught him that good intentions, if they were intentions, do not shield you from the consequences of how actions are perceived and received. Put these together and you see a pattern that can reshape any person. The repeated lesson that you are not fully in control and that your choices, your timing, and your alliances can reverberate far beyond what you intended. The temptation in a dramatic narrative is to frame all of this as fate, as if the universe singled him out. But the more credible interpretation is simpler and more human. A life lived at high speed produces more collisions. Fame multiplies exposure. Exposure multiplies risk. And risk eventually becomes a kind of tax. You pay it in privacy, in peace, in the ability to make mistakes without losing your name. For Ashton, illness was a tax of a different kind, paid not in headlines but in nerve endings and dizziness, in blurred light and lost sound, in a year of wondering whether he would ever feel normal again. When people talk about surviving something like that, they often romanticize the recovery. They want the neat ending. He overcame it. He learned a lesson. He became grateful. Real recovery is less cinematic. It is humiliating. It is repetitive. It is a man practicing steps like a toddler, learning the geometry of his own body again. It is a man waking up anxious, testing his senses with the dread of someone flipping a switch and waiting to see if the room lights up. It is a man trying to smile for his family while privately negotiating fear. If he disappears, will they remember his voice? If he survives, will he survive as the same person or as a stranger wearing his own face? This is where the goodbye in the title can be interpreted as something more complex than retirement. A goodbye to recklessness. A goodbye to the belief that youth is endless. A goodbye to the version of himself that could treat life as a series of scenes, always moving to the next one before the emotions of the previous scene had time to settle. Illness forces you to stay in the moment, because the moment is where symptoms live. You cannot outrun your own bloodstream. And yet, there is another layer: accountability. When you have been publicly criticized, especially in a case involving sexual assault and the broader cultural reckoning that comes with it, you become aware that survival alone is not enough. You can live and still be wrong. You can recover physically and still need to repair moral damage. You can love your family and still cause harm through decisions that protect your comfort more than they protect the vulnerable. The transcript hints at this without fully unpacking it, but it is central to what makes the story resonate. The man does not just fight a disease. He fights the reality that the life he built includes choices that people will judge, and some of that judgment will be deserved. This matters because public redemption narratives often skip the hardest part, the part where you sit with consequences without rushing to a clean conclusion. It is easy to film an apology video. It is harder to live differently when no one is watching. It is easy to say you have changed. It is harder to become the kind of person whose judgment improves under stress. Illness can catalyze that improvement, but it cannot guarantee it. It simply creates the conditions where denial becomes harder to maintain. Ashton's relationship with Mila, as described in the transcript, becomes a kind of proving ground for that quieter transformation. Not the glamorous perfect couple montage, but the daily work of staying present. The work of listening, especially when you're someone trained to deflect with humor. The work of showing tenderness without performance. The work of being honest about fear instead of hiding it behind charm. When you have 2 children and a body that has recently betrayed you, the definition of bravery changes. It becomes less about risking everything and more about protecting what you have. There's also the question of legacy. The transcript repeatedly circles it. If I disappear, will anyone remember the real me? That question is not narcissism. It is vulnerability. Because being famous does not guarantee being known. In fact, it can guarantee the opposite. The public knows your highlights and your scandals, but not your private prayers. Not the nights you lay awake counting heartbeats. Not the mornings you felt your balance return and cried quietly because you did not want anyone to see how scared you had been. Not the long, awkward stretches where you wanted to do the right thing, but did not know what right required. So part 3 of this story, the way I read it, is not simply the middle act of a celebrity tragedy. It is the turning point where the icon collapses into a person, where the narrative shifts from spectacle to stakes. Because when you nearly lose your senses, you learn that survival is not just continuing to exist. Survival is learning how to live with clarity. Clarity about what matters, clarity about what you have done, clarity about what you still owe to others. And that is why the ending of this section should not be a triumphant cheer. It should be a sober pause. He survived the disease. He regained much of what he lost. But the deeper question remains unanswered, and maybe it should remain unanswered for now. After everything, the childhood terror, the proximity to tragedy, the public failures, the backlash, the year of physical collapse, what kind of man is he choosing to be when the lights are off? The difference between a public life and a private life is not just the number of people watching. It is the fact that the public version always becomes a story, while the private version remains an experience. For Ashton Kutcher, those 2 realities have been pulling against each other for decades, sometimes violently. The public version is clean enough to be packaged. The charming Midwestern kid who became a star, the handsome comedic icon, the man who seemed to glide through Hollywood with a grin. The private version is Messier, a boy shaped by fear, a young man carrying guilt, an adult learning that love and loss can share the same bed, and a husband discovering that some mistakes cannot be fixed by apologies alone. That tension matters because it explains why the transcript reads like a long confession disguised as entertainment. It is not satisfied with listing facts. It keeps returning to an emotional theme, the fear of being misunderstood. When Ashton says, in essence, "If I disappear, will anyone remember the real me?" he is not only talking about mortality. He is talking about narrative control. In the modern celebrity world, your life does not belong to you in the way ordinary lives do. Your worst moments become content. Your private grief becomes clickable. Your illnesses become updates. And if you do not define yourself carefully, the internet will do it for you. This becomes especially sharp in the chapters where moral complexity enters the frame. Tragedy alone tends to generate sympathy. But tragedy mixed with questionable judgment creates a colder audience. The transcript touches the Danny Masterson situation because it is one of those moments when the public did not simply witness Ashton's pain, it judged his choices. In that case, the backlash was not just about him. It was about a broader cultural reality. People are exhausted by celebrity protection networks, by powerful men being defended, by friendship being used as a shield against accountability. So when Ashton and Mila wrote a letter that appeared to support Masterson, the public reaction was immediate and furious. And in that fury, nuance evaporates. The intention behind the letter, whether it was loyalty, denial, or misguided optimism, became irrelevant to many observers. What mattered was the impact. It looked like a dismissal of victims' pain. This is the moment when goodbye can mean another thing. Goodbye to the illusion that popularity protects you. For a long time, Ashton's charm functioned like armor. Even when he made mistakes, He could recover through a combination of silence, career momentum, and the public's willingness to move on. But in the post-Me Too era, the rules changed. Some mistakes do not fade. Some decisions become permanent stains. And if you have built part of your identity around doing good, around philanthropy, activism, the idea of being a responsible adult, then hypocrisy is punished harder than simple foolishness. It is not just a fall, it is a collapse of trust. When he resigned from Thorn, the organization he co-founded to combat child sexual exploitation, it signaled that the situation was bigger than a bad headline. It was an admission that his presence could harm the mission. That is a brutal realization for any person, especially one who has likely told himself that his work in that space was proof he was not merely a Hollywood product. In other words, it threatened the part of his legacy that may have mattered most to him, the belief that he could use fame as leverage for something meaningful. Now return that to the private experience of illness, and you see why the transcript frames his later years as quieter. When people are publicly punished, they often react in one of two ways. They double down in defensiveness, or they retreat into silence. Ashton seems to have leaned toward retreat, at least according to the narrative here. And retreat is not always cowardice. Sometimes it is the only way to avoid becoming a constant performer in a culture that demands explanations but rarely grants forgiveness. At the same time, retreat can become avoidance, and avoidance can become a kind of emotional prison. The transcript suggests that marriage and family became the place where the real battle happened, because that is where you cannot hide behind brand management. A spouse sees your fear. Children expose your priorities. In a home, you cannot escape the consequences of your mood, your silence, or your unresolved shame. If Mila felt exhausted by the weight of old scandals, it was not only because of public chatter. It was because the past has a way of leaking into the present, especially when a person does not fully process it. Unspoken guilt becomes irritability. Unresolved grief becomes distance. A habit of enduring becomes a habit of shutting down. This is why the most convincing parts of the transcript are the smallest ones. Ashton gardening, cooking, trying to rebuild. Not because those details are dramatic, but because they are believable. After a serious health crisis, people often fall in love with ordinary life. They do not want the constant vibration of attention. They want routine. They want quiet. They want to watch their children grow without thinking of the world as a place that can steal everything overnight. But quiet does not erase the deeper questions. It only makes them louder. If you are a man who once depended on being liked, you eventually confront the uncomfortable truth that you cannot control who likes you. You can only control who you are. And that is a heavier responsibility than fame ever was. So what does saying goodbye mean in the emotional logic of this story? It can mean goodbye to the fast life, the parties, the impulsive ego of youth. It can mean goodbye to the illusion that love is something you can secure through gestures rather than daily character. It can mean goodbye to the belief that a reputation is a shield. It can even mean goodbye to the fantasy that you can keep your pain private forever when your life is public property. And yet, the most important goodbye may be internal. Goodbye to denial. Because illness, public backlash, and repeated losses all deliver the same lesson from different angles. They tell you that the world does not owe you an easy narrative. They tell you that survival is not the same as being safe. They tell you that you are responsible for what you do with the time you keep. In that sense, Ashton's story becomes less about a tragic diagnosis and more about a forced reckoning. Not a perfect redemption arc, not a clean fall from grace, but a complicated adult learning what many people learn without cameras, that the hardest part of life is not the dramatic moment when everything breaks. The hardest part is the slow rebuilding afterward, when you have to decide, quietly, repeatedly, without applause, what kind of person you will be. If you step back from the headlines and look at the emotional pattern beneath them, Ashton Kutcher's story reads less like a string of unrelated tragedies and more like a single psychological thread being pulled tighter over time. The thread is not fame. It is not romance. It is not even illness. It is the repeated experience of standing close to something irreversible and realizing, again and again, that you could not control it. When that becomes a theme in someone's life, it changes the way they move through the world. It changes how they love, how they cope, how they make decisions, and how they interpret risk. It can make you hyper-aware, always scanning for the next disaster. Or it can make you numb, because constant fear is exhausting and the mind eventually finds ways to shut down. The transcript's early anchor is his twin brother Michael. And the reason that chapter matters is not just because it is sad. It is because it introduces a form of survivor's guilt before he was old enough to name it. A child watching his brother fight to stay alive learns a terrible lesson. Existence can feel unfair. Why him and not me is not a logical question, but it is a human one. It is the mind trying to impose moral order on random suffering. And when that suffering is close, same age, same house, shared childhood, it can become personal in a way that lasts for decades. Even after the crisis passes, the emotional residue remains. It can lead a person to feel they must earn happiness, as if joy is a debt they are not allowed to enjoy freely. The kind of guilt often expresses itself indirectly. People imagine guilt as constant sadness, but more often it shows up as restlessness, risk-taking, self-sabotage, impulsivity. The transcript mentions mischief, theft, drinking, a youthful legal stumble. Whether every detail is perfectly framed or not, the psychology makes sense. When a person feels unworthy of stability, they sometimes test the world's boundaries. They create chaos because chaos feels familiar. They do things that confirm their internal narrative. See, I don't deserve the good things. I ruin them. It is not a conscious plan. It is a pattern. Then comes the Ashley Ellerin chapter, which adds a different layer of guilt, the guilt of proximity. There's a unique torment in being near a tragedy without being able to stop it. It creates a kind of phantom responsibility. You were there, but not there enough. You saw something, but not clearly enough. You could have acted differently, but you didn't because you didn't understand what you were seeing. The mind turns these could-haves into a loop. And the loop is punishing because it pretends to be logic while functioning like self-harm. Over time, it can erode trust in your own instincts. You begin to fear that your perception is unreliable, that you might miss the next warning sign, the next stain on the carpet, the next moment where a choice matters. If you carry that fear into adult relationships, it can distort love. Love begins to feel less like safety and more like a risk you must manage. You become simultaneously desperate for connection and afraid of what connection will cost you. That is how people end up trapped between intensity and distance, wanting closeness, then withdrawing when closeness exposes vulnerability. The transcript's portrayal of his marriage with Demi more touches this tension. Devotion mixed with pressure, and then a fracture that becomes public. Divorce, especially when it is amplified by fame, is not only an emotional ending. It is a public evaluation. It tells you that you failed at a role you wanted to succeed in, and it stamps that failure onto your identity. Many people respond to that with a defensive shell. They become guarded, even with those they love. They stop speaking openly because openness feels like a liability. They learn to endure quietly. But endurance has a cost. It makes you functional, but it can also make you emotionally absent. And emotional absence is one of the fastest ways to poison a relationship that depends on mutual safety. This is why the transcript's peace phase after his illness feels so important. When Ashton recovers and chooses a quieter life, it can look like growth. But psychologically, peace can also be frightening for someone trained to expect disaster. If your nervous system is calibrated to crisis, calm feels unnatural. It feels like waiting for the next blow. You start interpreting silence as a warning. You become suspicious of happiness. Some people, in that state, unconsciously create conflict just to restore the environment they know how to survive in. Others retreat deeper into routine, try to control the world through small, safe rituals. Illness intensifies this because it adds a new uncertainty, the uncertainty of the body. The body is the final shelter people assume they can rely on, and when it fails, it can create a permanent psychological vulnerability. Even after recovery, many people live with a subtle fear of relapse. Every headache, every dizzy moment, every strange sensation becomes a question. Is it back? That fear can make you more present, more grateful. It can also make you more anxious, more controlling, more protective of your time and energy. Now layer on the public controversy with Danny Masterson and the fallout that followed. This is the kind of moment that tests character under stress. Public backlash feels like danger. It triggers the same fight-or-flight response as physical threats. People either fight, defend, deny, counterattack, or flee, withdraw, apologize, disappear. If Ashton retreated and apologized, that may have been a tactical response, but it also might reflect the deeper pattern. When danger arrives, he goes quiet because he learned early that panic does not save anyone. Quiet is how you survive. The problem is that quiet can be misread as indifference, and in public controversies, perception can become reality faster than truth can catch up. So where does that leave him psychologically? The transcript suggests he is a man trying to live with the weight of multiple identities. The star, the husband, the father, the activist, the former reckless kid, the survivor of illness, the witness to tragedy, the person who has made mistakes that cannot be erased. That is a heavy load. And when someone carries that load for a long time, they begin to understand a painful truth. You cannot undo the past, but you can decide whether the past will keep directing your future. That is the quiet heart of Part 5. It is not only about what happened to Ashton Kutcher. It is about what repeated exposure to loss does to a person's inner world. It teaches you that love is fragile. It teaches you that time is cruel. It teaches you that your body can fail you. It teaches you that the crowd's affection is conditional. And then, if you're lucky, it teaches you something else. That peace is not something you deserve. It is something you practice. You practice it by making better choices, by telling the truth more often, by staying present even when fear tells you to run, and by learning, slowly, imperfectly, that survival is not only the refusal to die. It is the decision to live differently. If you step back from the headlines and look at the emotional pattern beneath them, Ashton Kutcher's story reads less like a string of unrelated tragedies and more like a single psychological thread being pulled tighter over time. The thread is not fame. It is not romance. It is not even illness. It is the repeated experience of standing close to something irreversible and realizing, again and again, that you could not control it. When that becomes a theme in someone's life, it changes the way they move through the world. It changes how they love, how they cope, how they make decisions, and how they interpret risk. It can make you hyper-aware, always scanning for the next disaster. Or it can make you numb, because constant fear is exhausting and the mind eventually finds ways to shut down. The transcript's early anchor is his twin brother Michael, and the reason that chapter matters is not just because it is sad. It is because it introduces a form of survivor's guilt before he was old enough to name it. A child watching his brother fight to stay alive learns a terrible lesson. Existence can feel unfair. Why him and not me is not a logical question, but it is a human one. It is the mind trying to impose moral order on random suffering. And when that suffering is close, same age, same house, shared childhood, it can become personal in a way that lasts for decades. Even after the crisis passes, the emotional residue remains. It can lead a person to feel they must earn happiness, as if joy is a debt they are not allowed to enjoy freely. The kind of guilt often expresses itself indirectly. People imagine guilt as constant sadness, but more often it shows up as restlessness, risk-taking, self-sabotage, impulsivity. The transcript mentions mischief, theft, drinking, a youthful legal stumble. Whether every detail is perfectly framed or not, the psychology makes sense. When a person feels unworthy of stability, they sometimes test the world's boundaries. They create chaos because chaos feels familiar. They do things that confirm their internal narrative. See? I don't deserve the good things. I ruin them. It is not a conscious plan. It is a pattern. Then comes the Ashley Ellerin chapter, which adds a different layer of guilt, the guilt of proximity. There's a unique torment in being near a tragedy without being able to stop it. It creates a kind of phantom responsibility. You were there, but not there enough. You saw something, but not clearly enough. You could have acted differently, but you didn't because you didn't understand what you were seeing. The mind turns these could-haves into a loop. And the loop is punishing because it pretends to be logic while functioning like self-harm. Over time, it can erode trust in your own instincts. You begin to fear that your perception is unreliable, that you might miss the next warning sign, the next stain on the carpet, the next moment where a choice matters. If you carry that fear into adult relationships, it can distort love. Love begins to feel less like safety and more like a risk you must manage. You become simultaneously desperate for connection and afraid of what connection will cost you. That is how people end up trapped between intensity and distance, wanting closeness, then withdrawing when closeness exposes vulnerability. The transcript's portrayal of his marriage with Demi more touches this tension. Devotion mixed with pressure, and then a fracture that becomes public. Divorce, especially when it is amplified by fame, is not only an emotional ending. It is a public evaluation. It tells you that you failed at a role you wanted to succeed in, and it stamps that failure onto your identity. Many people respond to that with a defensive shell. They become guarded, even with those they love. They stop speaking openly because openness feels like a liability. They learn to endure quietly. But endurance has a cost. It makes you functional, but it can also make you emotionally absent. And emotional absence is one of the fastest ways to poison a relationship that depends on mutual safety. This is why the transcript's peace phase after his illness feels so important. When Ashton recovers and chooses a quieter life, it can look like growth. But psychologically, peace can also be frightening for someone trained to expect disaster. If your nervous system is calibrated to crisis, calm feels unnatural. It feels like waiting for the next blow. You start interpreting silence as a warning. You become suspicious of happiness. Some people in that state unconsciously create conflict just to restore the environment they know how to survive in. Others retreat deeper into routine, try to control the world through small, safe rituals. Illness intensifies this because it adds a new uncertainty, the uncertainty of the body. The body is the final shelter people assume they can rely on, and when it fails, it can create a permanent psychological vulnerability. Even after recovery, many people live with a subtle fear of relapse. Every headache, every dizzy moment, every strange sensation becomes a question. Is it back? That fear can make you more present, more grateful. It can also make you more anxious, more controlling, more protective of your time and energy. Now layer on the public controversy with Danny Masterson and the fallout that followed. This is the kind of moment that tests character under stress. Public backlash feels like danger. It triggers the same fight-or-flight response as physical threats. People either fight, defend, deny, counterattack, or flee, withdraw, apologize, disappear. If Ashton retreated and apologized, that may have been a tactical response, but it also might reflect the deeper pattern. When danger arrives, he goes quiet because he learned early that panic does not save anyone. Quiet is how you survive. The problem is that quiet can be misread as indifference, and in public controversies, perception can become reality faster than truth can catch up. So where does that leave him, psychologically? The transcript suggests he is a man trying to live with the weight of multiple identities. The star, the husband, the father, the activist, the former reckless kid, the survivor of illness, the witness to tragedy, the person who has made mistakes that cannot be erased. That is a heavy load. And when someone carries that load for a long time, they begin to understand a painful truth. You cannot undo the past, but you can decide whether the past will keep directing your future. It is not only about what happened to Ashton Kutcher. It is about what repeated exposure to loss does to a person's inner world. It teaches you that love is fragile, It teaches you that time is cruel. It teaches you that your body can fail you. It teaches you that the crowd's affection is conditional. And then, if you're lucky, it teaches you something else. That peace is not something you deserve. It is something you practice. You practice it by making better choices, by telling the truth more often, by staying present even when fear tells you to run, and by learning, slowly, imperfectly, that survival is not only the refusal to die. It is the decision to live differently. The year his body collapsed did not feel like a dramatic turning point while he was living it. It felt like erosion, like something invisible was grinding him down a fraction at a time until the day arrived when he could no longer pretend it was temporary. People imagine serious illness as a single catastrophic moment, a siren, a rush to the hospital, a clean before and after. But what he described was more unsettling. Waking up and realizing your senses were no longer reliable. Vision faltering, hearing slipping, balance failing. The world becoming unfamiliar while you are still inside it. There is a particular terror in losing sight and sound at the same time. It is not only that you cannot function, it is that you cannot orient. You cannot confirm what is real. You can't reassure yourself with the most basic proof of life. The face of someone you love, the sound of your child calling your name, the steady rhythm of ordinary noise. In that state, the mind reaches for the nearest familiar memory of helplessness. And for Ashton, helplessness had a face. A hospital bed, tubes, a brother whose heartbeat depended on medicine and luck. The transcript frames it almost like a cruel echo. As a boy, he watched his twin fight for life. As an adult, he lay there wondering if he would ever return to the life he had built. That is where the countdown begins, not a countdown to death in a literal sense, but a countdown to the moment you either surrender or choose to fight without guarantees. When doctors explain vasculitis, they explain it with probabilities, risks, and monitoring. But patients hear it differently. They hear the words as threats. This could affect your organs. This could be permanent. We need to act quickly. The body becomes a minefield, and every symptom feels like a step in the wrong direction. You start living in a narrow window of time. The next test, the next appointment, the next morning when you open your eyes and check what has been taken overnight. In that narrow window, identity becomes fragile. For a celebrity, the loss of capacity threatens career and income. For a father, it threatens the ability to protect. For a husband, it threatens the ability to show up. And for a person who has already been publicly judged, it threatens something even more intimate, dignity. If you have spent years trying to convince the world you are more than your mistakes, illness can feel like the ultimate humiliation. You cannot argue with it. You cannot charm it. You cannot outrun it. You are reduced to the basics: breath, blood, stability. That is why the transcript keeps returning to the same haunting question. If I disappear, will anyone remember the real me? Because he knows how narratives work. He knows how easily a person is flattened into a list of controversies and sound bites. He knows how the internet preserves the worst versions of you with perfect clarity while your best intentions remain invisible. When you're facing the possibility of losing your senses, you start thinking about legacy in an unromantic way. Not awards, not box office, not applause. Legacy becomes, what did I leave in the people who loved me? What did my children absorb from my behavior? What did my wife carry alone when I was too proud to admit fear? And the hardest legacy question of all is accountability. When you are sick, you want compassion. But when you have been wrong, compassion can feel conditional. The world is not always willing to separate suffering from judgment. A person can be ill and still be criticized. A person can recover physically and still be asked to answer for moral failures. The transcript hints that this dual pressure, physical vulnerability and public scrutiny, pushed Ashton into a quieter life. It is not difficult to imagine why. When you are depleted, you become allergic to noise. You stop chasing the crowd. You start seeking spaces where you can exist without being interpreted. Recovery, then, becomes a slow negotiation with fear. The transcript describes nearly a year of rebuilding. relearning steps, rebuilding strength, waiting for senses to return. But the deeper part is psychological. Because the first time you lose your balance, you learn a kind of dread that does not fully go away. Even when you can walk again, part of you remembers the fall. Even when you can see again, part of you fears the blur. Even when you can hear again, part of you listens for silence. You become more careful, yes, but also more aware. And awareness has a sharpening effect. It makes you notice what you used to ignore, how quickly a day can vanish, how often you postpone what mattered, how easily you traded presence for performance. That is why, after recovery, the story naturally moves toward simplicity. Not because simplicity is a perfect cure, but because it is a form of control that does not require illusion. Gardening, cooking, time with children, a smaller circle, fewer appearances, less appetite for being seen. When you have been close to losing your senses, you start valuing the senses you still have. You value the sound of a child laughing in another room, the sight of sunlight through curtains, the feel of a hand in yours, the ordinary miracles that make a life. In the end, what changed Ashton Kutcher was not a single scandal, not a single heartbreak, and not even the rare illness that nearly stole his senses. What changed him was the accumulation. The way life kept returning him to the same lesson from different angles. You cannot control everything, and you cannot outrun the consequences of what you do. When you are young, you interpret that lesson as cruelty. When you are older, when you have watched people vanish, watched love break, watched your own body fail, you begin to interpret it as truth. A hard truth, but a clarifying one. The transcript frames a story as a goodbye, and the most honest way to understand that goodbye is as a separation from illusion. Goodbye to the idea that charm can solve what character must face. Goodbye to the belief that fame is a shield. Goodbye to the comfort of pretending that pain, once buried, stays buried. Illness has a brutal way of exposing what you have been avoiding, because when you lose the ability to distract yourself with motion, you are left with yourself. And yourself is where every memory, every regret, every unanswered question waits. For Ashton, those questions began in childhood. The early fear of losing his twin brother carved a permanent sensitivity into him. Even as he grew into a public figure, a man praised for confidence and ease, that sensitivity likely remained underneath. Sometimes as compassion, sometimes as anxiety, sometimes as the restless need to prove he deserved the life he was given. People often assume celebrities are immune to ordinary insecurity because they're surrounded by affirmation. But affirmation is not the same as safety. If anything, constant validation can make real security harder to find because it trains you to measure worth through applause rather than integrity. Then adulthood piled on experiences that reinforce the same theme: sudden, irreversible loss. The Ashley Ellerin tragedy left him with a kind of guilt that doesn't respond to logic. Divorce left him with a public wound that did not heal just because time moved forward. And later, when controversy struck, when public outrage turned into a judgment of his character, he faced another reality that many people eventually face in their own smaller lives. Intention does not erase impact. You can believe you're being loyal, or fair, or supportive, and still cause harm. And when harm becomes part of your story, you cannot undo it by insisting you meant well. You can only respond with humility, accountability, and a real change in judgment moving forward. That is why the final chapter of this story is not about whether Ashton is good or bad. That framing is too simplistic, and it mirrors the worst habits of celebrity culture. The real question is whether he is learning, whether he is willing to be honest about the places where he failed, whether he is capable of choosing a life defined less by image and more by responsibility. It is easy to perform remorse. It is harder to live differently when no one is filming. The illness, in this narrative, becomes the moment when all the noise is stripped away. When he says he lost vision, hearing, and balance, what you're really hearing is a man describing the sudden loss of control, the one thing fame can never buy back. And for a year, his world narrowed to the essentials. Wake up, check if you can see, check if you can hear, try to walk, fall, try again. Recovery became a daily confrontation with fear. And fear, when faced long enough, often produces an unexpected outcome: clarity. Clarity does not mean peace arrives instantly. It means you stop confusing distraction for healing. It means you understand that surviving something does not automatically make you wise, but it does give you a choice. You can return to the same habits, the same ego, the same avoidance. Or you can let survival reshape your priorities. The transcript suggests Ashton chose the second path, at least in part. Less obsession with the spotlight, more devotion to family, more appreciation for the quiet life. That shift is believable not because it sounds noble, but because it sounds tired in the way people are tired when they have finally had enough of pretending. And yet, even a quieter life comes with its own test, because when you slow down, you feel everything more sharply. You notice the places where you still carry guilt. You notice the places where you still hide. You notice the ways your past still tries to control your present. Peace is not a destination. It is a practice. It is waking up and choosing presence over escape. It is choosing patience over defense. It is choosing to listen, especially when listening is uncomfortable. It is choosing to be the kind of person your children can trust, not just the kind of person the world can admire. So if this story resonates, it may not be because you care about Hollywood. It may be because you recognize the emotional truth underneath it, the way people smile while breaking inside, the way they keep moving because stopping would mean feeling everything they've stored away. Many people live like that. They look fine to everyone else while privately wondering whether anyone actually knows them. They measure their worth by how well they can keep going, not by how honestly they can heal. That is why the ending should land on a question rather than a conclusion. Because a life like this is not finished by one diagnosis, one apology, or one recovery. It continues in choices made quietly, away from headlines. The question is not whether Ashton Kutcher survived. The transcript makes clear that he did. The question is what survival will mean for him now. Will he let the cracks become excuses, or will he let them become openings, places where humility can enter, where empathy can deepen, where judgment can improve? Will he be remembered as a man who escaped disaster, or as a man who finally learned what mattered when disaster made everything else irrelevant? And for the viewer, the question becomes personal. If your life suddenly stripped away the things you rely on, your routine, your health, your distractions, what would be left? Who would you be when the lights go out?